Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio, and more specifically, welcome to the first episode of what I am calling the Horror-Thon, not just for 2020, but in the history of MetrObelisk Radio. Well, a very short history, but you get my point. And for the first Horror-Thon episode, I wanted to take a look at all of the Sharknado movies since there are 6 of them. Now, I know that these movies are made for TV horror, but they still classify as horror to me. They're shark movies, for crying out loud. If these movies don't classify as horror, then Jaws doesn't classify as horror by that logic. Then Jaws is an action movie with a shark in it. Now, these movies premiered on the SYFY Network in July of 2013, and they made one every year until 2018. Now, it's not a stretch to say that these movies made a ton of money to warrant 6 of them, but are these movies any good? Are they worth your time? Do these movies try to be like Jaws, or do they try to be like Piranha? Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, MetrObeliskRadio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute Library, or whatever platform you are currently watching this on. And with that out of the way, let's get right into the Sharknado series. So as always, we're going to start off with the creative team of all these movies. Now, all of these movies were directed by Anthony C. Ferrante. Now, he's directed a lot of movies that have either been direct-to-cable or direct-to-video. Those movies include Boo, Zombie Tidal Wave, Forgotten Evil, and the Hansel and Gretel. That was a straight-to-video modern retelling of the classic horror tale, and that released in 2013. Then we have the writers, and there's 2 writers in this series. You have Thunder Levin. Now, he only wrote the first 4 movies, even though he's actually credited for writing all 6. Now, his other writing credits include Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood, AE Apocalypse Earth, Geo Disaster, and Megalodon, all straight-to-video / straight-to-cable horror. Then we have Scotty Mullen, and he only wrote Sharknadoes 5 and 6. Now, his other writing credits include Zombies. Yes, there is a horror movie called Zombies, look it up. And along with the sequel to Zombies, Zombies 2, Nazi Overlord, and The Co-Ed and the Zombie Stoner. Now, all these movies were produced by David Michael Latt. Now, he's produced a lot of direct-to-video and direct-to-cable movies that include Super Croc, King of the Lost World, which is basically just a King Kong ripoff, Jane White is Sick and Twisted, and Mega Shark vs. Giant Octopus. Now, to close this section off, none of these guys are really here to write or produce The Godfather or The Shining. Their goal is really to make a bunch of midnight movies, and that's what they've done. And don't discredit the guys that are making a lot of B movies, because a lot of people like Roger Corman and Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, have basically made their careers off of B movies. Now let's move on to the actor-character analysis portion of this, and I'm going to focus on doing an actor-character analysis of all 6 movies, and there's only 3 characters that you're really going to care about during this series. So we'll start off with the lead, and that's Ian Zuring as Finn Shepard. Now, he's the main character throughout this series, as I just stated. Now, he's the guy who stops all the Sharknadoes in all 6 movies. Now, if the name Ian Zuring rings a bell, then that's because it should. Most people know him from Beverly Hills 90210 when he played Steve Sanders, and he was one of only 4 actors to be in every episode of 90210, and that show ran for a total of 292 episodes. Now, he would move on to do other things like voice Harry Osborn in the Spider-Man new animated series that was on MTV back in 2003, and also for any Godzilla fans, he provided the voice of Dr. Nico Tatopoulos, and I'm sorry I have not seen Godzilla because that series followed the 1998 movie with Matthew Broderick. I've yet to see it. Then we have Tara Reid as April Wexler. Now, April is the quote-unquote wife of Finn Shepard. They were separated in the first movie, but then got back together in the sequels. In the second movie, she loses her hand, and that's what leads her to get a modified buzzsaw so she can kill the sharks. She then becomes fully robotic because she gets quote-unquote killed off in Sharknado 3. And with this character, yeah, she started normal, but got more and more robotic as the series went on. Now, most of you listening to this know Tara Reid as Vicky from American Pie, hopefully. Now, she did other movies such as The Big Lebowski as Bunny Lebowski. She did Van Wilder with Ryan Reynolds back in the day, and Urban Legend with Jared Leto. And the last character we're going to touch on is Cassie Serbo as Nova Clark. Now, she only appears in four of the 6 movies. Now, even though she was only in 4 of the movies, she's actually important to the series. She starts off as just a waitress at Finn's Bar on the Santa Monica Pier, and then becomes a full-on warrior hell-bent on killing all of the sharks for killing her grandfather years and years prior. The only Sharknado movies that Nova are not in are Sharknadoes 2 and 4, and technically she's in the last 20 to 30 seconds of Sharknado 4, but we don't count that. Now the big thing that Cassie Serbo is known for was being Lauren Tanner in the ABC Family series Make It or Break It, and that was the show that followed the gymnasts that had hopes of making it to the Olympics one day. She's also been in Bring It On, In It to Win It. That was one of the straight-to-video sequels for Bring It On, and I've personally never seen any of the Bring It On movies, so whatever. Agoraphobia, My Life as a Dead Girl, and she was supposed to star as Captain Kirk's granddaughter in Star Trek Progeny. Now, Star Trek Progeny being a Star Trek fan film that the fan film guidelines destroyed and was later released as an animated short. And if you're curious to know about the Star Trek fan film guidelines, I brought them up in my Star Trek Beyond retrospective, and it's probably up on the platform that you're currently watching this on. I'll put a link to that in the description of this episode below. Now let's actually jump into the movies in this series, and we're going to start off with the very first movie, which is just Sharknado. Now, the movie is basically about these cyclone/water tornadoes being started by a hurricane that's pushing all of these sharks up onto land that are killing everyone that they come into contact with. Now, this being the first movie in the franchise means that not all of the kinks are going to be worked out right away. I feel that this movie takes itself too seriously at times given its premise. The premise being that it's Jaws meets Twister. Now, this isn't The Godfather or Goodfellas or The Shining or insert X movie here. You know, it should be a movie that sells itself on the ridiculousness of the premise, but I feel that the movie holds itself back intentionally. Now, the story at the heart of the movie is a surfer who owns a bar, has to rescue his family from these Sharknadoes that are popping up all over LA. Oh no! Sharknadoes killing everyone in Los Angeles! Now, the movie does highlight the ridiculousness by the end where Finn's son flies up in the helicopter with Nova to drop bombs in the middle of these tornadoes to cancel themselves out. Now, Nova gets eaten by a shark, but somehow lives because she was swallowed whole. Then Finn gets eaten by the same shark, but cuts through him with a chainsaw. Now, to close off this movie, because there really wasn't much to it, I feel that the filmmakers didn't really embrace the ridiculousness of the premise, and I feel that the first movie really suffered as a result. Now, like I said, this movie is basically Jaws meets Twister, and this should have felt more like Piranha. Now, either the Joe Dante movie or the Alexander Aja movie that came out in 2010. And one thing that I forgot about, one really stupid line in this movie that never escapes me, is when they're about to go on the 405. And there's a bunch of traffic on the what's that called? On the freeway ramp. And you have one guy going there, "Come on, man, you live in California, why are you scared of a little rain?" Says the guy living in a city that rains maybe 10 days out of the year. Now let's move on to Sharknado 2, the second one. And yes, it is called that, Sharknado 2, the second one. Now, this movie, instead of taking place in LA, it takes place in New York. Now, since the first movie, April has written a book that is called How to Survive a Sharknado. And they're going to New York for a book tour, but another Sharknado basically threatens that. Now, this movie plays into the more ridiculous nature of the first one. And in this movie, they show shows like Michael and Kelly, that was previously Regis and Kelly, as well as the Today Show with Matt Lauer and Al Roker. And this is more shown with the Today Show segments where they're talking about the Sharknadoes and have actual graphics depicting where the sharks will fall and also how fast they'll be falling from out of the sky. Try saying that 3 times fast. And the sharks are going to be coming down at 2 inches per hour. So you better get your umbrellas ready and stay indoors. Back to you, Matt. Thanks, whoever I'm blowing under my desk. Oh, what? Sorry, that's a few years too early for that one. This movie came out in 2014. Now, even though this movie is basically the same as the first one in the sense that it's about Finn needing to save his family, in this case, it's his sister and her husband with their 2 kids. Now, there is a different resolution to beating the Sharknado in this movie, at least. You know, in the first movie, they built bombs to throw into the Sharknado to cancel them out. In this movie, not only does building the bombs not work, it actually makes the situation worse, where now sharks are raining from the sky in a fiery hailstorm. Now, in order to beat the Sharknado now in this movie, Finn has to go to the top of the Empire State Building and freeze the tornado using the Freon tanks. And for those of you who don't know, Freon is what's running in your air conditioner. And the Empire State Building is used as a lightning rod to ignite it into the air to freeze out the Sharknado. And as I just stated, this movie does get more ridiculous than the first one. In the beginning, April loses her hand and gets it replaced with a modified buzzsaw so she can cut through the sharks. Now, if there was a time to really go for it in terms of ridiculousness, it was now. I understand that the first movie had problems with taking itself too seriously at times, but I attribute that problem to being the first movie. It's like the pilot of a TV show. Yeah, the first episode of this TV show had a lot of problems, but again, it's a pilot episode. What are you expecting? You know, if Sharknado hadn't gotten more ridiculous by now, then its charm would have worn off this early and we wouldn't be talking about another 4 movies beyond this one. Aw, hell no. Now we gotta move on to Sharknado 3, which is conveniently titled Shark 3, oh hell no. Now this movie takes the ridiculousness of the first 2 movies and just cranks it up to 11. In this movie, there are a bunch of Sharknadoes that are appearing all up and down all over the East Coast. If Finn doesn't stop these in time, then the entire East Coast gets wiped out. Boo-hoo-hoo. Cry me a river. To show how ridiculous it is, this movie has a James Bond type of intro at first with the shark mouth acting as the sniper scope and having Finn jump through it with a chainsaw. And also in this movie, April is pregnant with Finn's son. Now, how is this movie more ridiculous than the first 2? First, Mark Cuban is the president in this movie. Yes, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks and one of the hosts on Shark Tank, so and his vice president is none other than Ann Coulter, and I am not going into my personal opinions on that because I am vowed to piss at least half of you off. Then David Hasselhoff comes in as Finn's father, and yes, they have to go to space in order to stop the Sharknadoes. Now, they do eventually stop the Sharknadoes, and that causes the sharks to start launching themselves into space. And this is the moment where I feel the filmmakers became very self-aware because the sharks are surviving in space. Now, how are the sharks surviving in space? Well, how have they been surviving up in the clouds for so long? Who knows, and really, who cares? Now, how did Finn and April get back down to Earth, you might ask? Was it in the shuttle that they went up in and, ground control to Major Tom? Well, not exactly. They both get swallowed by the big shark and then went crashing into the atmosphere, burning the shark up, and then Finn launched a couple of parachutes and they landed safely right down on a nice little beachhead. Now, this is the first movie to actually end on a cliffhanger. At the end, April and Finn's son is born. April goes to retrieve the wings that David Hasselhoff's character gives them, and you see a piece of the shuttle basically come for her. Now, did the piece of the shuttle hit her, or does she walk away? Stay tuned for the next installment of... Now, there was only one way for the series to go further if it wanted to remain relevant, and that was to get more ridiculous than even the second movie did. The second movie took itself seriously as well, but not to the extent that the first movie did. This one just throws the baby out with the bathwater and doesn't take itself seriously at all. But it works given how ridiculous the original premise is, which is Jaws meets Twister. And they even acknowledge that connection in the movie. When Finn's daughter's in Universal Studios Orlando, she walks by the Jaws shark before she goes on the Twister roller coaster. And that was a very nice nod, what you would also call a fourth wall break to the audience that, yeah, this is all our movies are. And to close off this section, oh, hell no. Now let's talk about Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens. Now, this movie has a Star Wars type opening with a black screen and SYFY Presents in the blue letters and the 4 dots. And then it cuts to the stars with the big Sharknado in yellow pulling back. And yes, it even has an opening crawl. Given that this title is very similar to Star Wars The Force Awakens, this really didn't shock me, but it did make me laugh at it for a bit. Now, this movie makes it known that there hasn't been a Sharknado in 5 years, so basically, We are 5 years removed from Sharknado 3. As always, there's a Sharknado that forms in Vegas out of sand. There's a company in this movie called Astro X that's developed a technology that can handle the Sharknados, but they can't beat the Sharknados in this movie because the Sharknados in this movie aren't water-based, they're more sand-based here. And we see different Sharknados throughout this movie, probably just to give it that edge over the other movies in the franchise. We see the Boulder-nado, and that's the one that's formed out of the sand and the rocks get into the sharks. We see an Oil-nado that forms into a Fire-nado, which, I don't feel I have to explain that jump in logic, but there is a huge problem with that logic of, the Oil-nado becoming the Fire-nado. The Fire-nado would cancel itself out once all the oil is burned up. So if there's nothing for that fire to latch onto, it's going to die anyway. Then we see an Electro-nado, a Nuke-nado, and a Cow-nado of all things. Now, the amount of different tornadoes gets ridiculous, but I get what it's here for. It's really to add to the ridiculousness of these movies. Now, in keeping with the ridiculousness, we do see the return of David Hasselhoff, and we also see Gilbert Gottfried as the Storm Chaser for the Today Show that's reporting on all these, ex-NATOs that I don't want to repeat the names of. Gary Busey's also in here. He was the head scientist who we later find out is April's father, and he brought her back to life with the robotics. Dog the Bounty Hunter even makes an appearance in this one as Chop Top, who owns a chainsaw store, and we even see an appearance from Carrot Top as a limo driver, but sadly no props are used. How sad for Carrot Top. Now, the problem with having a franchise that is always upping the ante is at some point you're going to run out of places to go. I think we've now seen all of the possible NATOs that we can see, and we've already been to Los Angeles, we've been to New York, we've been to DC and Orlando, and we start this movie in Kansas, go to Vegas, and then end at Niagara Falls. It's time to take these movies out of the United States. And that's how we get to our next entry in this series, Sharknado 5, Global Swarming. Global what? If you can tell me what that's from, then you're awesome. Now, this movie opens with titles and a set piece from Indiana Jones. Yes, it's getting more and more funny. It started with Sharknado 3. We had a James Bond opener instead of just plain text. Then in Sharknado 4, we had a Star Wars type opening and a lot of Star Wars references throughout the movie. Great, kid. Don't get cocky. So where do we go from here in terms of the opening? I don't want to predict because if I'm wrong, I'm just going to disappoint myself. Now, in this movie, they start off in London. Finn and Nova discover a Druid artifact that they used to fight the Sharknados when they came during their time. And before anyone asks, yes, the Druids were real. A Druid was a member of a high-ranking class in Celtic culture. And the earliest that we know about them dates all the way back to the 4th century BCE. And the Druids, from what I've read on them, were responsible for organizing the worship services and sacrifices, and they also had the power to essentially excommunicado people from religious festivals, essentially making them the social pariahs, social outcasts of the time. Now, the cave paintings that were seen in the beginning of this movie, along with the shark fin idol, plays into the religious side of the Druids. Now, the beginning of the movie in the cave with Finn and Nova basically plays out like Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indy and Satipo retrieve that golden idol. The only difference here is instead of a boulder chasing them out of the entrance, it's a flood with a bunch of sharks. Now, removing the idol in this movie basically causes a Sharknado to form. So unlike in the previous 4 movies where they were started by nature, Finn and Nova actually started this one, which is rather interesting to have a man-made Sharknado versus a nature-made. Now, Finn and April's son, Gil, gets sucked up into the Sharknado. And in this movie, Finn only cares about pulling Gil out of the Sharknado, whereas Nova's wanting to stop all the Sharknados for good. Now, in this Sharknado, there is a vortex that can transport Finn and April to different countries around the world as they're trying to get Gil out. Gil doesn't get pulled from the Sharknado, but Finn and April get transported to Egypt and a bunch of other countries along the way. Now, there they find a machine that the ancient Egyptians used to quell the Sharknados. Now, Finn and April inadvertently caused the apocalypse by this point. April dies because she uses all of her energy to stop the Sharknadoes worldwide for good, and all of Finn's family dies along with everyone on the face of the earth, leaving Finn to essentially become that lone wanderer. Now, that is until an older Gil comes back in a time machine to rescue his dad. Now, it's explained that Gil simply traveled through time, after the Sharknado basically collapsed, and he perfected the time travel by harnessing the vortex using a what? A flux capacitor. Now, the movie ends the same way as Back to the Future with the whole, where we're going, we don't need roads. I'm not humming any further because fuck you, MG. And it also has the title card from the end of Back to the Future Part 2 with the "to be continued." Now, I can't omit this from the Sharknado 5 section. Gilbert Gottfried is back as the Ron McDonald weatherman on the ground. He's in Africa reporting on a Sharknado there. Well, you see here, there are gazelles and now lions getting sucked up into there. Now the sharks are chasing the lions who are chasing the gazelles. It's a safari-nado! Yeah, I can't do Gilbert Gottfried at all, so pardon me. I'm like Trey Parker and Matt Stone on South Park, where our impressions on this show are done very, very horribly, intentionally. Just ignore the fact that I can't do impressions to save my life. Gilbert Gottfried, you're here to add to the ridiculousness of the movies. Look at how far he has come from just being the guy in the upper right square on the game show Hollywood Squares. Now it's about time that we get to the Last Sharknado. So let's look at the Last Sharknado. It's about time. Now this movie doesn't have any stylized opening like a James Bond opener or Star Wars or Indiana Jones. Instead, this movie just picks up immediately where Sharknado 5 left off, and this movie gets straight into the action, and that's a good thing, given that this movie is the conclusion to the series. Now, the title for this movie is what I would call a double entendre. On one hand, the title is self-aware in the sense that we're finally on the last of these terrible movies. Thank God. Now, also, the premise of this movie is in the title, It's About Time. Basically spelling out that this movie is centered around time travel, if you remember the ending of Sharknado 5. Now, the time travel in this movie takes its logic from Back to the Future, that time is not linear. In fact, you can create alternate timelines if you go into the past and change certain things. And there are even quite a few nods to the Back of the Future series. Back to the Future series, not Back of the Future. Back to the Future. Now, one of the things is the pocket-sized flux capacitor. Another thing is Finn and the other characters having to travel at speeds of 88 miles an hour in order to go through the time vortex. Now, this movie goes everywhere from the age of the dinosaurs to medieval Europe to the American Revolution to the Old West to a future that's ruled by the robotic Aprils. Now, during this time travel, it does bring some character arcs full circle, and the biggest one is Nova. She originally leaves a letter for her grandfather back in the American Revolution days, but Finn tears it up. It's later discovered and taped together as she sees it when she tried to stop her grandfather from dying. Now she learns that's where she gets her name from, is that very letter. Now what she learns after this is she was supposed to be the one who crashed the boat, only this time the younger version of herself and her grandfather made it out alive, whereas she personally didn't. Now this leads into killing these characters off for good. Gil brought these characters back to help Finn, but they all pretty much ended up getting killed, including Finn himself. Now, the very end of this movie goes back to the first Sharknado that we see at the beginning of the first movie, and he ends up dying to prevent the first Sharknado movie from essentially ever happening. Now, what this did is it prevented creating the time paradox. The new versions of Finn, April, Nova, and his kids would have never known what happened with the Sharknadoes, because this isn't a new timeline where they never broke out. Finn doesn't become the hero that saved everyone from these Sharknadoes, and he's just a family man and bar owner. Now, before I close this off, I can't leave out Gilbert Gottfried. He comes back when they travel back to Santa Monica in the 60s on the newscast in front of the camera. He called the Sharknado a Shark and Roll-nado, given that a rock band was playing on that beach just prior to the Sharknado breaking out, and it was, everybody do the shark, da 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 da. Yeah, whatever bullshit that was. It was obviously a parody. I believe it was a parody of a song called Let's Go to the Hop. It came out in the late 50s, early 60s, and that's the closest that song sounded to me, at least. Now let's look at how this movie series was received. Now, as you can imagine, all of these movies did not receive the highest critical or audience scores of the like. Now, the first movie actually got the highest Rotten Tomatoes score of 78% for some reason, and the lowest scoring Rotten Tomatoes score is Sharknado 4 at 14%. And if we take all the percentages of each installment on Rotten Tomatoes, we get an average Rotten Tomatoes score of 41% right on the nose. Now, it's not great, but it's not terrible for the series. And likewise, if we look at IMDb, the highest IMDb score goes to Sharknado 3 at 4.1 out of 10, and the lowest scoring movie in the series goes to the first movie at a 3.3 out of 10. And if we take all these movies' scores and average them, we get an average IMDb score of 3.8 out of 10 for the entire series. Now, I can't look into how much each movie made because these were not released theatrically. They were released on the SYFY Network, so Comcast doesn't have to report to the public how much each of these movies grossed, how much they made in syndication. Now, they obviously made enough money to warrant 6 of them. But I did find the reported budgets for these movies. Now, the cheapest movie to make was the first one at anywhere from, $1.5 to $2 million. And the last one was the most expensive budget at a grand total of $5 million. Now, not only were they making a lot of money for the SYFY Network and Comcast, they were insanely fucking cheap to produce in terms of making movies. Look, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. These movies are B-movie schlock that you would watch as a midnight horror movie. Are these movies trying to be anything else, though? No, not really. The filmmakers knew that these movies would basically be like the midnight horror movies that you watch and don't take seriously at all. Now, the movies got more science fiction-y by the end, but that was only for the Last Sharknado, and they had to end the series somehow and make it so there couldn't be a number 7. And what was the best way to end a series that was getting so ridiculous and crazy? Number 1, return to normal, and if you couldn't simply return to normal, then number 2, create an alternate timeline where the first Sharknado movie never happened, and they did the latter. Now, and I'll end this episode off with this. These movies aren't terrible for what they are, but I do feel that them being made for TV really held them back in terms of the blood and gore. Now, these are horror movies based around sharks and people either getting crushed by them or eaten by them. In fact, one of the best running gags in the series is Finn always getting eaten by a shark in every movie and living to tell the tale. Now, with people getting eaten by sharks that are coming from the sky, I was expecting a little more in the blood and gore department. That way the movie can feel more like Piranha rather than the edited for television version of Piranha. Now, if you were to ask me which of these movies are the best of the bunch, I would personally say Sharknado's 3, 4, and 5. Just because those movies took the ridiculous nature of the premise and cranked it all the way up to 11. Sharknado 1 took itself a little too seriously in all of the wrong places, and Sharknado 2 frankly wasn't that much better. The Sharknado, not terrible. I can personally see why the series needed to end the way it ended. The problem with Sharknado 1, 2, and the Last Sharknado is I feel there's no rewatchability like you had in, Sharknado's 3, 4, and 5. Now, Sharknado 4 and 5 at least had Gilbert Gottfried in there to really add to the ridiculousness of the premise of a tornado filled with sharks. And he was also in Sharknado 6, but for a very, very brief amount of time. Now, watch these movies if you're curious. Keep in mind, you're not getting Jaws here, and you're not even getting Piranha, really. You're getting the edited for television version of Piranha.